Hello. So, what a... Hi. Yeah, I figured there's gonna be a few people watching Diane. I'm sorry to get my hair out of my thingy. Yeah, so I need coffee. Coffee is life. Coffee is the thing I need in my life. See, my coffee is empty. Oh my gosh. Okay, I got this, I've got a clip on my headphone thing that keeps it from blah blah blah. Oh my gosh. It keeps it from flapping around all over the place, so I keep it clipped somewhere. Oh, getting my coffee going. Just barely out of reach. Oh, lovely, lovely coffee. Creamer. I need this stuff. I need this stuff. And so I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing today. I need to roll up a couple of balls of wool to get ready for a project. So I think that's probably what I'm going to be fiddling with. And yeah, today it's Canterbury Tales. Miss Faye send a share via direct message to there. Send it. Hey Angie, coffee. I know. So yeah, I don't know what I'm gonna be doing today, but I'm playing 3 chapters from this book, and the first one's the only one that's not long. They're all long, so I'm gonna be close to 2 hours. So I'll be fiddling and farting around with stuff and have fun and enjoy the book. Let's see. Mute me.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Edited by D. Lang Purves. Note by the reader: the preface you are about to hear has been modified. The original preface was written for an edition that included Spenser's The Faerie Queene, lesser-known poems by both Chaucer and Spenser, and copious notes by the editor, D. Lang Purves. In this LibriVox recording of the Canterbury Tales, a decision was taken to focus only on the text itself. To view the notes, which are very helpful, please go to the LibriVox catalogue page of the Canterbury Tales, where you will find a link to the Gutenberg e-text used for this reading. Preface. The object of this volume is to place before the general reader our early poetic masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales, to do so in a way that will render its popular perusal easy in a time of little leisure and unbounded temptations to intellectual languor. The Canterbury Tales, so far as they are in verse, have been printed without any abridgment or designed change in the sense. But the 2 tales in prose, Chaucer's tale of Melibœus and the parson's long sermon on penitence, have been contracted so as to exclude 30 pages of unattractive prose. The gaps thus made in the prose tales, however, are supplied by careful outlines of the omitted matter, so that the reader need be at no loss to comprehend the whole scope and sequence of the original. As regards the manner in which the text is presented, the editor is aware that some whose judgment is weighty will differ from him. This volume has been prepared for popular perusal, and its very raison d'être would have failed if the ancient orthography had been retained. It has often been affirmed by editors of Chaucer in the old forms of the language that a little trouble at first would render the antiquated spelling and obsolete inflections a continual source, not of difficulty, but of actual delight, for the reader coming to the study of Chaucer without any preliminary acquaintance with the English of his day, or of his copyists' days. Despite this complacent assurance, the obvious fact is that Chaucer in the old forms has not become popular in the true sense of the word. He is not understanded of the vulgar. In this volume, therefore, the text of Chaucer has been presented in 19th century garb. But there has been not the slightest attempt to modernize Chaucer in the wider meaning of the phrase, to replace his words by words which he did not use, or, following the example of some operators, to translate him into English of the modern spirit as well as the modern forms. So far from that, in every case where the old spelling or form seemed essential to metre, to rhyme, or to meaning, no change has been attempted. But wherever its preservation was not essential, the spelling of the monkish transcribers, for the most ardent purist must now despair of getting the spelling of Chaucer himself, has been discarded for that of the reader's own day. It is a poor compliment to the father of English poetry to say that by such treatment the bouquet and individuality of his works must be lost. If his masterpiece is valuable for one thing more than any other, it is the vivid distinctness with which English men and women of the 14th century are there painted for the study of all the centuries to follow. But we wantonly balk the artist's own purpose, and discredit his labour, when we keep before his picture the screen of dust and cobwebs which, for the English people in these days, the crude forms of the infant language have practically become. Shakespeare has not suffered by similar changes, Spenser has not suffered. It would be surprising if Chaucer should suffer, when the loss of popular comprehension and favour in his case are necessarily all the greater for his remoteness from our day. In his other poems we behold Chaucer as he was, a courtier, a gallant, pure-hearted gentleman, a scholar, a philosopher, a poet of gay and vivid fancy, playing around themes of chivalric convention, of deep human interest, or broad-sighted satire. In the Canterbury Tales we see not Chaucer, but Chaucer's times and neighbours. The artist has lost himself in his work. To show him honestly and without disguise, as he lived his own life, and sung his own songs at the brilliant court of Edward III, is to do his memory a moral justice far more material than any wrong that can ever come out of spelling. From books the editor has derived valuable help, as from Mr. Cowden Clarke's revised modern text of the Canterbury Tales, published in Mr. Mimo's library edition of the English Poets, from Mr. Wright's scholarly edition of the same work, from the indispensable Tyrwhitt, from Mr. Bell's edition of Chaucer's poem, and from many others. The editor leaves his task with the hope that his attempt to remove artificial obstacles to the popularity of one of England's earliest poets will not altogether miscarry. D. Lane Purves. End of Preface. Recorded by Gesine in Valletta, June 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on February the 8th, 2006. The Canterbury Tales and Other Poems of Geoffrey Chaucer, edited by D. Lang Purvis. The Life of Geoffrey Chaucer. Not in point of genius only, but even in point of time, Chaucer may claim the proud designation of first English poet. He wrote The Court of Love in 1345, and The Romaunt of the Rose, if not also Troilus and Cressida, probably within the next decade. The dates usually assigned to the poems of Laurence Minot extend from 1335 to 1355, while The Vision of Piers Plowman mentions events that occurred in 1360 and 1362. Before which date Chaucer had certainly written The Assembly of Fowls and his Dream. But though they were his contemporaries, neither Minot nor Langland, if Langland was the author of The Vision, at all approached Chaucer in the finish of the force or the universal interest of their works and the poems of earlier writers, as Laymon and the author of Ormulum are less English than Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Norman. Those poems reflected the perplexed struggle for supremacy between the two grand elements of our language, which marked the 12th and 13th centuries. A struggle intimately associated with the political relations between the conquering Normans and the subjugated Anglo-Saxons. Chaucer found two branches of the language, that spoken by the people, Teutonic in its genius and its forms, and that spoken by the learned and the noble, based on the French. Yet each branch had begun to borrow of the other, just as nobles and people had been taught to recognize that each needed the other in the wars and the social tasks of the time. And Chaucer, a scholar, a courtier, a man conversant with all orders of society, but accustomed to speak, think, and write in the words of the highest, by his comprehensive genius cast into the simmering mould a magical amalgamate, which, made of two half-hostile elements, unite and interpenetrate each other. Before Chaucer wrote, there were two tongues in England, keeping alive the feuds and resentments of cruel centuries. When he laid down his pen, there was practically but one speech. There was, and ever since has been, but one people. Geoffrey Chaucer, according to the most trustworthy traditions, for authentic testimonies on the subject are wanting, was born in 1328, and London is generally believed to have been his birthplace. It is true that Leland, the biographer of England's first great poet, who lived nearest to his time, not merely speaks of Chaucer as having been born many years later than the date now assigned, but mentions Berkshire or Oxfordshire as the scene of his birth. So great uncertainty have some felt on the latter score, that elaborate parallels have been drawn between Chaucer and Homer, for whose birthplace several cities contended, and whose descent was traced to the demigods. Leland may seem to have had fair opportunities of getting at the truth about Chaucer's birth, for Henry VIII had him, at the suppression of the monasteries throughout England, to search for records of public interest, the archives of the religious houses. But it may be questioned whether he was likely to find many authentic particulars regarding the personal history of the poet in the quarters which he explored, and Leland's testimony seems to be set aside by Chaucer's own evidence as to his birthplace, and by the contemporary references which make him out an aged man for years preceding the accepted date of his death. In one of his prose works, The Testament of Love, the poet speaks of himself in terms that strongly confirm the claim of London to the honour of giving him birth, for he there mentions the city of London, that is to me so dear and sweet, in which I was forth growed, and more kindly love, says he, have I to that place than to any other in earth, as every kindly creature hath full appetite to that place of his kindly engenderer, and will rest and peace in that place to abide. This tolerably direct evidence is supported, so far as can be at such an interval of time, by the learned Camden. In his Annals of Queen Elizabeth he describes Spenser, who was certainly born in London, as being a fellow citizen of Chaucer's, Edmundus Spenserus, patria Londinicis, musius adeo aridindibus natus ut omnes Anglicos superiores evi poetas ne Chaucero quidem concibe excepto supranet. The records of the time notice more than one person of the name of Chaucer who held honourable positions about the court, and though we cannot distinctly trace the poet's relationship with any of these namesakes or antecessors, we find excellent ground of belief that his family or friends stood well at court, in the ease with which Chaucer made his way there, and in his subsequent career. Like his great successor, Spenser, it was the fortune of Chaucer to live under a splendid, chivalrous, and high-spirited reign. 1328 was the second year of Edward III, and, what with Scotch wars, French expeditions, and the strenuous and costly struggle to hold England in a worthy place among the states of Europe, there was sufficient bustle, bold achievement, and high ambition in the period to inspire a poet who was prepared to catch the spirit of the day. It was an age of elaborate courtesy, of high-paced gallantry, of courageous venture, of noble disdain for mean tranquillity, and Chaucer, on the whole a man of peaceful avocations, was penetrated to the depth of his consciousness with the lofty and lovely civil side of that brilliant and restless military period. No record of his youthful years, however, remains to us. If we believe that on the age of 18 he was a student at Cambridge, it is only on the strength of a reference in his Court of Love, where the narrator is made to say that his name is Philogenet of Cambridge clerk, while he had already told us that when he stirred to seek the court of Cupid he was at 18 years of age. According to Leland, however, he was educated at Oxford, proceeding thence to France and the Netherlands to finish his studies, but there remains no certain evidence of his having belonged to either university. At the same time, it is not doubted that his family was of good condition, and whether or not we accept the assertion that his father held the rank of knighthood, rejecting the hypothesis that made him a merchant or a vintner at the corner of Curtain Lane, it is plain from Chaucer's whole career that he had introductions to public life and recommendations to courtly favour wholly independent of his genius. We have the clearest testimony that his mental training was of wide range and thorough excellence, although rare for a mere courtier in those days. His poems attest his intimate acquaintance with the divinity, the philosophy, and the scholarship of his time, and show him to have had the sciences, as then developed and taught, at his fingers' ends. Another proof of Chaucer's good birth and fortune would be found in the statement that, after his university career was completed, he entered the Inner Temple, the expenses of which could be borne only by men of noble and opulent families. But although there is a story that he was once fined 2 shillings for thrashing a Franciscan friar in Fleet Street, we have no direct authority for believing that the poet devoted himself to the uncongenial study of the law. No special display of knowledge on that subject appears in his works, yet in the sketch of the Manciple, in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, may be found indications of his familiarity with the internal economy of the Inns of Court, while numerous legal phrases and references hint that his comprehensive information was not at fault on legal matters. Leland says that he quitted the university a ready logician, a smooth rhetorician, a pleasant poet, a grave philosopher, an ingenious mathematician, and a holy divine; and by all accounts, when Geoffrey Chaucer comes before us authentically for the first time, at the age of 31, he was possessed of knowledge and accomplishments far beyond the common standard of his day. Chaucer at this period possessed also other qualities fitted to recommend him to favour in a court like that of Edward III. Urey describes him, on the authority of a portrait, as being then of fair beautiful complexion, his lips red and full, his size of a just medium, and his port and air graceful and majestic. So continues the ardent biographer, so every ornament that could claim the approbation of the great and fair, his abilities to record the valour of the one and celebrate the beauty of the other, and his wit and gentle behaviour to converse with both, conspired to make him a complete courtier. If we believe that his Court of Love had received such publicity as the literary media of the time allowed in the somewhat narrow and select literary world, not to speak of Troilus and Cressida, which, as Lydgate mentions, is first among Chaucer's works, some have supposed to be a youthful production. We find a third and not less powerful recommendation to the favour of the great co-operating with his learning and his gallant bearing. Elsewhere reasons have been shown for doubt whether Troilus and Cressida should not be assigned to a later period of Chaucer's life, but very little is positively known about the dates and sequence of his various works. In the year 1386, being called as witness with regard to a contest on a point of heraldry between Lord Scrope and Sir Robert Grosvenor, Chaucer deposed that he entered on his military career in 1359. In that year Edward III invaded France for the third time, in pursuit of his claim to the French crown, and we may fancy that, in describing the embarkation of the knights in Chaucer's Dream, the poet gained some of the vividness and stir of his picture from his recollections of the embarkation of the splendid and well-appointed royal host at Sandwich, on board the 1100 transports provided for the enterprise. In this expedition the laurels of Poitiers were flung on the ground. After vainly attempting Rennes and Paris, Edward was constrained by cruel weather and lack of provisions to retreat towards his ships. The fury of the elements made the retreat more disastrous than an overthrow in pitched battle. Horses and men perished by the thousands, or fell into the hands of the pursuing French. Chaucer, who had been made a prisoner at the siege of Réther, was among the captives in the possession of France when the Treaty of Brittany, the Great Peace, was concluded, in May 1360. Returning to England, as we may suppose, at the peace, the poet ere long fell into another and a pleasanter captivity, for his marriage is generally believed to have taken place shortly after his release from foreign durance. He had already gained the personal friendship and favour of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the king's son. The Duke, while Earl of Richmond, had courted and won to wife, after a certain delay, Blanche, daughter and co-heiress of Henry, Duke of Lancaster, and Chaucer is by some believed to have written the Assembly of Fowls to celebrate the wooing, as he wrote Chaucer's Dream to celebrate the wedding of his patron. The marriage took place in 1359, the year of Chaucer's expedition to France, and, as in the Assembly of Fowls, the Formel, or female eagle, who is supposed to represent the Lady Blanche, begs that her choice of a mate may be deferred for a year. 1358 and 1359 have been assigned as the respective dates of the two poems already mentioned. In the Dream, Chaucer prominently introduces his own lady-love, to whom, after the happy union of his patron with the Lady Blanche, he is wedded amid great rejoicing, and various expressions in the same poem show that not only was the poet high in favour with the illustrious pair, but that his future wife had also peculiar claims on their regard. She was the younger daughter of Sir Payne Roet, a native of Hainault, who had, like many of his countrymen, been attracted to England by the example and patronage of Queen Philippa. The favourite attendant on the Lady Blanche was her elder sister, Catherine, subsequently married to Sir Hugh Swynford, a gentleman of Lincolnshire, and destined, after the death of Blanche, to be in succession governess of her children, mistress of John of Gaunt, and lawfully wedded Duchess of Lancaster. It is quite sufficient proof that Chaucer's position at court was of no mean consequence, to find that his wife, the sister of the future Duchess of Lancaster, was one of the royal maids of honour, and even, as Sir Harris Nicolas conjectures, a goddaughter of the Queen, for her name was also Philippa. Between 1359, when the poet himself testifies that he was made prisoner while bearing arms in France, and September 1366, when Queen Philippa granted her former maid of honour, by the name of Philippa Chaucer, a yearly pension of 10 marks, or £6 13 shillings 4 pence, we have no authentic mention of Chaucer, express or indirect. It is plain from this grant that the poet's marriage with Sir Payn Roet's daughter was not celebrated later than 1366. The probability is that it closely followed the return from the wars. In 1367, Edward III settled upon Chaucer a life pension of 20 marks for the good service which our beloved valet, Dilectius Valetus Noster, Geoffrey Chaucer, has rendered, and will render in time to come. Camden explains Valetus Hospitii to signify a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Selden says that the designation was bestowed upon young heirs designed to be knighted, or young gentlemen of great descent and quality. Whatever the strict meaning of the word, it is plain that the poet's position was honourable and near to the king's person, and also that his worldly circumstances were easy, if not affluent, for it need not be said that 20 marks in those days represented 12 or 20 times the sum in these. It is believed that he found powerful patronage, not merely from the Duke of Lancaster and his wife, but from Margaret, Countess of Pembroke, the king's daughter. To her Chaucer is supposed to have addressed the goodly ballad, in which the lady is celebrated under the image of the daisy. Her he is by some understood to have represented under the title of Queen Alcestis in the Court of Love, and the prologue to The Legend of Good Women, and in her praise we may read his charming descriptions and eulogies of the daisy, French Marguerite, the name of his royal patroness. To this period of Chaucer's career we may probably attribute the elegant and courtly, if somewhat conventional, poems of The Flower and the Leaf, The Cuckoo and the Nightingale, etc. The Lady Margaret, says Urry, would frequently compliment him on his poems, but this is not to be meant of his Canterbury tales, they being written in the latter part of his life, when the courtier and the fine gentleman gave way to solid sense and plain descriptions. In his love pieces he was obliged to have the strictest regard to modesty and decency, the ladies at that time insisting so much on the nicest punctilios of honour, that it was highly criminal to deprecate their sex, or do anything that might offend virtue. Chaucer, in their estimation, had sinned against the dignity and honour of womankind by his translation of the French Roman de la Rose, and by his Troilus and Cressida, assuming it to have been among his less mature works, and to atone for those offences the Lady Margaret, though other and older accounts say it was the first queen of Richard II, Anne of Bohemia, prescribed to him the task of writing The Legend of Good Women. About this period, too, we may place the composition of Chaucer's A.B.C., or the Prayer of Our Lady, made at the request of the Duchess Blanche, a lady of great devoutness in her private life. She died in 1369, and Chaucer, as he had allegorized her wooing, celebrated her marriage, and aided her devotions, now lamented her death in a poem entitled The Book of the Duchess, or The Death of Blanche. In 1370 Chaucer was employed on the king's service abroad, and in November 1372, by the title of Suctifer Noster, our esquire or shield-bearer, he was associated with Jacobus Pronan and Johannes de Mari Civis Janususis in a royal commission, bestowing full powers to treat with the Duke of Genoa, his council and state. The object of the embassy was to negotiate upon the choice of an English port at which the Genoese might form a commercial establishment; and Chaucer, having quitted England in December, visited Genoa and Florence, and returned to England before the end of November 1373, for on that day he drew his pension from the Exchequer in person. The most interesting point connected with this Italian mission is the question whether Chaucer visited Petrarch at Padua. That he did is unhesitatingly affirmed by the old biographers, but the authentic notices of Chaucer during the years 1372 and 1373, as shown by the researches of Sir Harris Nicolas, are confined to the facts already stated, and we are left to answer the question by the probabilities of the case, and by the aid of what faint light the poet himself affords. We can scarcely fancy that Chaucer, visiting Italy for the first time in a capacity which opened for him easy access to the great and famous, did not embrace the chance of meeting a poet whose works he evidently knew in their native tongue and highly esteemed. With Mr. Wright we are strongly disinclined to believe that Chaucer did not profit by the opportunity of improving his acquaintance with the poetry, if not the poets, of the country he thus visited, whose influence was now being felt on the literature of most countries of Western Europe. That Chaucer was familiar with the Italian language appears not merely from his repeated selection as envoy to Italian states, but by many passages in his poetry, from Assembly of Fowls to the Canterbury Tales. In the opening of the first poem there is a striking parallel to Dante's inscription on the gate of hell. The first song of Troilus, in Troilus and Cressida, is a nearly literal translation of Petrarch's 88th sonnet. In the prologue to The Legend of Good Women there is a reference to Dante which can hardly have reached the poet at second hand, and in Chaucer's great work, as in The Wife of Bath's Tale and The Monk's Tale, direct reference by name is made to Dante, the wise poet of Florence, the great poet of Italy, as the source whence the author has quoted. When we consider the poet's high place in literature and at court, which could not fail to make him free of the hospitalities of the brilliant little Lombard states, his familiarity with the tongue and the works of Italy's greatest bards, dead and living, the reverential regard which he paid to the memory of great poets, of which we have examples in The House of Fame and at the close of Troilus and Cressida, along with his own testimony in the prologue to The Clerk's Tale, we cannot fail to construe that testimony as a declaration that the tale was actually told to Chaucer by the lips of Petrarch in 1373, the very year in which Petrarch translated it into Latin from Boccaccio's Decameron. Mr. Bell notes the objection to this interpretation, that the words are put into the mouth not of the poet but of the clerk, and meets it by the counter-objection that the clerk, being a purely imaginary personage, could not have learned the story at Padua from Petrarch, and therefore that Chaucer must have departed from the dramatic assumption maintained in the rest of the dialogue. Instances could be adduced from Chaucer's writings to show that such a sudden departure from the dramatic assumption would not be unexampled. Witness the aside in The Wife of Bath's prologue, where, after the jolly dame has asserted that half so boldly where can no man swear and lie as woman can, the poet hastens to interpose in his own person these two lines: I say not this by wives that be wise, but if it be when they them misadvise. And again in the prologue of The Legend of Good Women, from a description of the daisy: she is the clearness and the very light that in this dark world me guides and leads. The poet, in the very next line, slides into an address to his lady: the heart within my sorrowful heart you dreads and loves so sore, that ye be verily the mistress of my wit, and nothing I. When, therefore, the Clerk of Oxford is made to say that he will tell a tale, The which that I learned at Padua of a worthy clerk, as proved by his words and his work, he is now dead and nailed in his chest. I pray to God give his soul good rest. Francis Petrarch, the laureate poet, hight this clerk, whose rhetoric so sweet illumined all Italy of poetry. But forth to tellen of this worthy man that taught me this tale, as I began. We may without violent effort believe that Chaucer speaks in his own person, though dramatically the words are on the clerk's lips. And the belief is not impaired by the sorrowful way in which the clerk lingers on Petrarch's death, which would be less intelligible if the fictitious narrator had only read the story in the Latin translation than if we suppose the news of Petrarch's death at Arcueil in July of 1374 to have closely followed Chaucer to England, and to have cruelly and irresistibly mingled itself with our poet's personal recollections of his great Italian contemporary. Nor must we regard as without significance the manner in which the clerk is made to distinguish between the body of Petrarch's tale and the fashion in which it was set forth in writing, with a poem that seemed a thing impertinent, save that the poet had chosen in that way to convey his matter, told or taught so much more directly and simply by word of mouth. It is impossible to pronounce positively on the subject. The question whether Chaucer saw Petrarch in 1373 must therefore remain a moot point, so long as we have only our present information, but fancy loves to dwell on the thought of the two poets conversing under the vines at Arcueil, and we find in the history and the writings of Chaucer nothing to contradict, a good deal to countenance, the belief that such a meeting occurred. Though we have no express record, we have indirect testimony that Chaucer's Genoese mission was discharged satisfactorily, for on the 23rd of April, 1374, Edward III grants at Windsor to the poet, by the title of our beloved squire, dilecto armigero nostro, unum saecer, vini, one pitcher of wine, daily, to be perceived in the port of London, a grant which, on the analogy of more modern usage, might be held equivalent to Chaucer's appointment as poet laureate. When we find that soon afterwards the grant was commuted for a money payment of 20 marks per annum, we need not conclude that Chaucer's circumstances were poor, for it may be easily supposed that the daily perception of such an article of income was attended with considerable prosaic inconvenience. A permanent provision for Chaucer was made on the 8th of June, 1374, when he was appointed Controller of the Customs in the port of London, for the lucrative imports of wools, skins, or wool fells and tanned hides, on condition that he should fulfil the duties of that office in person, and not by deputy, and should write out the accounts with his own hand. We have what seems evidence of Chaucer's compliance with these terms in the House of Fame, where, in the mouth of the eagle, the poet describes himself, when he has finished his labour and made his reckonings, as not seeking rest and news in social intercourse, but going home to his own house, and there, all so dumb as any stone, sitting at another book, until his look is dazed. And again, in the record that in 1376 he received a grant of £731, 4 shillings 6pence, the amount of a fine levied on one John Kent, whom Chaucer's vigilance had frustrated in the attempt to ship a quantity of wool for Dordrecht without paying the duty, the seemingly derogatory condition that the controller should write out the accounts or rolls (rotulos) of the office with his own hand, appears to have been designed or treated as merely formal. No records in Chaucer's handwriting are known to exist, which could hardly be the case if, for the 12 years of his controllership, 1374 through 1386, he had duly complied with the condition, and during that period he was more than once employed abroad, so that the condition was evidently regarded as a formality even by those who had imposed it. Also, in 1374, the Duke of Lancaster, whose ambitious views may well have made him anxious to retain the adhesion of a man so capable and accomplished as Chaucer, changed into a joint life annuity remaining to the survivor, and charged on the revenues of the Savoy a pension of £10, which 2 years before he settled on the poet's wife, whose sister was then the governess of the Duke's 2 daughters, Philippa and Elizabeth, and the Duke's own mistress. Another proof of Chaucer's personal reputation and high court favour at the time is his selection in 1375 as ward to the son of Sir Edmund Staplegate of Bilsington in Kent, a charge on the surrender of which the guardian received no less a sum than £104. We find Chaucer in 1376 again employed in a foreign mission. In 1377, the last year of Edward III, he was sent to Flanders with Sir Thomas Percy, afterwards Earl of Worcester, for the purpose of obtaining a prolongation of the truce, and in January 1378 he was associated with Sir Guichard d'Angle and his commissioners to pursue certain negotiations for a marriage between Princess Mary of France and the young King Richard II, which had been set on foot before the death of Edward III. The negotiation, however, proved fruitless, and in May of 1378 Chaucer was selected to accompany Sir John Berkeley on a mission to the court of Bernardo Visconti, Duke of Milan, with the view, it is supposed, of concerting military plans against the outbreak of war with France. The new king, meantime, had shown that he was not insensible to Chaucer's merit, or to the influence of his tutor and the poet's patron, the Duke of Lancaster, for Richard II confirmed to Chaucer his pension of 20 marks, along with an equal annual sum, for which the daily pitcher of wine, granted in 1374, had been commuted. Before his departure for Lombardy, Chaucer, still holding his post in the customs, selected 2 representatives or trustees to protect his estate against legal proceedings in his absence, or to sue in his name defaulters and offenders against the imports which he was charged to enforce. One of these trustees was called Richard Forester, the other was John Gower, the poet, the most famous English contemporary of Chaucer, with whom he had for many years been on terms of admiring friendship, although from the strictures based on certain productions of Gower's in the prologue of the Man of Law's Tale, it has been supposed that in the later years of Chaucer's life the friendship suffered some diminution. To the moral Gower and the philosophical Strode Chaucer directed or dedicated his Troilus and Cressida, while in the Confessio Amantis Gower introduces a handsome compliment to his greater contemporary as the disciple of the poet of Venus, with whose glad songs and ditties made her praise during the flowers of his youth. The land was filled everywhere. Gower, however, a monk and a conservative, held to the party of the Duke of Gloucester, the rival of the Wickliffiate and innovating Duke of Lancaster, who was Chaucer's patron, and whose cause was not a little aided by Chaucer's strictures on the clergy. And thus it is not impossible that political differences may have weakened the old bonds of personal friendship and poetic esteem. Returning from Lombardy early in 1379, Chaucer seems to have been again sent abroad, for the records exhibit no trace of him between May and December of that year. Whether by proxy or in person, however, he received his pensions regularly until 1382, when his income was increased by his appointment to the post of Controller of Petty Customs in the port of London. In November of 1384 he obtained a month's leave of absence on account of his private affairs, and a deputy was appointed to fill his place, and in February of the next year he was permitted to appoint a permanent deputy, thus at length gaining relief from that close attention to business which probably curtailed the poetic fruits of the poet's most powerful years. Chaucer is next found occupying a post which has not often been held by men gifted with his particular genius, that of a county member. The contest between the Dukes of Gloucester and Lancaster and their adherents for the control of the government was coming to a crisis, and when the recluse and studious Chaucer was induced to offer himself to the electors of Kent as one of the knights of their share, where presumably he held property, we may suppose that it was with the view of supporting his patron's cause in the impending conflict. The Parliament in which the poet sat assembled at Westminster on the 1st of October, and was dissolved on the 1st of November, 1386. Lancaster was fighting and intriguing abroad, absorbed in the affairs of his Castilian succession. Gloucester and his friends at home had everything their own way. The Earl of Suffolk was dismissed from the Woolsack and impeached by the Commons, and although Richard at first stood out courageously for the friends of his uncle Lancaster, he was constrained by the refusal of supplies to consent to the proceedings of Gloucester. A commission was wrung from him under protest, appointing Gloucester, Arundel, and 12 other peers and prelates a permanent council to inquire into the condition of all the public departments, the courts of law, and the royal household, with absolute powers of redress and dismissal. We need not ascribe to Chaucer's parliamentary exertions in his patron's behalf, nor to any malpractices of his official conduct, the fact that he was among the earliest victims of the commission. In December 1386 he was dismissed from both his offices in the port of London, but he retained his pensions, and drew them regularly, twice a year, at the Exchequer, until 1388. In 1387 Chaucer's political reverses were aggravated by a severe domestic calamity. His wife died, and with her died the pension which had been settled on her by Queen Philippa in 1366, and confirmed to her at Richard's accession in 1377. The change made in Chaucer's pecuniary position by the loss of his offices and his wife's pension must have been very great. It would appear that during his prosperous times he had lived in a style quite equal to his income, and had no ample resources against a season of reverse; for on the 1st of May 1388, less than a year and a half after being dismissed from customs, he was constrained to assign his pensions by surrender in chancery to one John Scalby. In May 1389, Richard II, now of age, abruptly resumed the reins of government, which, for more than 2 years, had been ably but cruelly managed by Gloucester. The friends of Lancaster were once more supreme in the royal councils, and Chaucer speedily profited by the change. On the 12th of July he was appointed Clerk of the King's Works at the Palace of Westminster, the Tower, the royal manors of Kennington, Eltham, Clarendon, Sheen, Byfleet, Children Langley, and Feckenham, the castle at Berkhamsted, the royal lodge at Hathenberg in the New Forest, the lodges in the parks of Clarendon, Children Langley, and Feckenham, and the mews for the King's falcons at Charing Cross. He received a salary of 2 shillings per day, and was allowed to perform the duties by deputy. For some reason unknown, Chaucer held this lucrative office little more than 2 years, quitting it before the 16th of September 1391, at which date it had passed into the hands of one John Gedney. The next 2 years and a half are blank, so far as authentic records are concerned. Chaucer is supposed to have passed them in retirement, probably devoting them principally to the composition of the Canterbury Tales. In February 1394 the king conferred upon him a grant of £20 a year for life, but he seems to have had no other source of income, and to have become embarrassed by debt, for frequent memoranda of small advances on his pension show that his circumstances were, in comparison, greatly reduced. Things appear to have grown worse and worse for the poet, for in May 1398 he was compelled to obtain from the king letters of protection against arrest, extending over a term of 2 years. Not for the first time, it is true, for similar documents had been issued at the beginning of Richard's reign, but at that time Chaucer's missions abroad, and his responsible duties in the port of London may have furnished reasons for securing him against annoyance or frivolous prosecution, which were wholly wanting at a later date. In 1398 fortune began again to smile on him. He received a royal grant of a tun of wine annually, the value being about £4. Next year, Richard II, having been deposed by the son of John of Gaunt, Henry of Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster, the new king, 4 days after his accession, bestowed on Chaucer a grant of 40 marks, £26, 13 shillings 4pence per annum, in addition to the pension of £20 conferred by Richard II in 1394. But the poet, now 71 years of age, and probably broken down by the reverses of the past few years, was not destined long to enjoy his renewed prosperity. On Christmas Eve of 1399 he entered on the possession of a house in the garden of the chapel of the Blessed Mary of Westminster, near to the present site of Henry VII's chapel, having obtained a lease from Robert Hermodesworth, the monk of the adjacent convent, for 53 years, at an annual rent of 4 marks, £2, 13 shillings 4pence. Until the 1st of March, 1400, Chaucer drew his pensions in person. Then they were received for him by another hand, and on the 25th of October in the same year he died, at the age of 72. The only lights thrown by his poems on the closing days are furnished in a little ballad called Good Counsel of Chaucer, which, though they were said to have been written when upon his deathbed lying in his great anguish, breathes the very spirit of courage, resignation, and philosophic calm, and by the retractation at the end of the Canterbury Tales, which, if it was not foisted in by monkish transcribers, may be supposed the effect of Chaucer's regrets and self-reproaches on that solemn review of his life-work, which the close approach of death compelled. The poet was buried in Westminster Abbey, and not many years after his death a slab was placed on a pillar near his grave, bearing the lines taken from the epitaph or eulogy made by Stephanus Sigorius of Milan at the request of Caxton: Galfridus Chaucer, vates, et fama poesis, materne hoc sucra sum tumultuus humo. Around 1555, Mr. Nicholas Brigham, a gentleman of Oxford, who greatly admired the genius of Chaucer, erected the present tomb, as near to the spot where the poet lay before the chapel of St. Bennet as was then possible by reason of the cancelli, which the Duke of Buckingham subsequently obtained leave to remove, that room might be made for the tomb of Dryden. On the structure of Mr. Brigham, besides a full-length representation of Chaucer, taken from a portrait drawn by his scholar, Thomas O'Cleve, was, or is, though now almost illegible, the following inscription: M.S. Qui fuit anglorum vates ter maximis olim, Galfridus Chaucer, conditur hoc tumulo, annum si queres domini, si tempora vitae, ecce notae substunt, que tibi chunca notant. 25 Octobris 1400. Ere nirmanum requis mors, en Brigham host fecit, musarum nomni sumptus. 1556. Concerning his personal appearance and habits, Chaucer has not been reticent in his poetry. Urey sums up the traits of his aspect and character fairly thus: he was of a middle stature, the latter part of his life inclinable to be fat and corpulent, as appears by the host's bantering him in his journey to Canterbury, and comparing shapes with him. His face was fleshy, his features just and regular, his complexion fair and somewhat pale, his hair of a dusky yellow, short and thin, the hair of his beard in two forked tufts of a wheat colour, his forehead broad and smooth, his eyes inclining usually to the ground, which is intimated by his host's words, his whole face full of liveliness, a calm, easy sweetness, and a studious, venerable aspect. As to his temper, he was a mixture of the gay, the modest, and the grave. The sprightliness of his humour was more distinguished by his writings than by his appearance, which gave occasion to Margaret, Countess of Pembroke, often to rally him upon his silent modesty in company, telling him that his absence was more agreeable to her than his conversation, since the first was productive of agreeable pieces of wit in his writings. But the latter was filled with a modest deference, and too distant respect. We see nothing merry or jocose in his behaviour with his pilgrims, but a silent attention to their mirth rather than any mixture of his own. While disengaged from public affairs, his time was entirely spent in study and reading. So agreeable to him was this exercise that he says he preferred it to all other sports and diversions. He lived within himself, neither desirous to hear, nor busy to concern himself with the affairs of his neighbours. His course of living was temperate and regular. He went to rest with the sun, and rose before it, and by that means enjoyed all the pleasures of the better part of the day, his morning walk and fresh contemplations. This gave him the advantage of describing the morning in so lively a manner as he does everywhere in his works. The springing sun glows warm in his lines, and the fragrant air blows cool in his descriptions. We smell the sweets of the bloomy haws, and hear the music of the feathered choir, wherever we take a forest walk with him. The hour of the day is not easier to be discovered from the reflection of the sun in Titian's paintings than in Chaucer's morning landscapes. His reading was deep and extensive, his judgment sound and discerning. In one word, he was a great scholar, a pleasant wit, a candid critic, a sociable companion, a steadfast friend, a grave philosopher, a temperate economist, and a pious Christian. Chaucer's most important poems are Troilus and Cressida, the Romaunt of the Rose, and the Canterbury Tales. Of the first, containing 8,246 lines, an abridgment with a prose connecting outline of the story is given in this volume. With the second, consisting of 7,699 octosyllabic verses, like those in which the House of Fame is written, it is found impossible to deal with in the present edition. The poem is a curtailed translation from the French Roman de la Rose, commenced by Guillaume de Loris, who died in 1260, after contributing 4,070 verses, and completed in the last quarter of the 13th century by Jean de Meun, who added some 18,000 verses. It is a satirical allegory in which the vices of courts, the corruptions of the clergy, the disorders and inequalities of society in general are unsparingly attacked, and the most revolutionary doctrines are advanced, and though, in making his translation, Chaucer softened or eliminated much of the satire in the poem, still it remained in his verse a caustic exposure of the abuses of the time, especially those which discredited the Church. The Canterbury Tales are presented in this edition with as near an approach to completeness in regard for the popular character of the volume permitted. The 17,385 verses of which the poetical tales consist have been given without abridgment or purgation, save in a single couplet, but the main purpose of the volume being to make the general reader acquainted with the poems of Chaucer and Spenser, the editor has ventured to contract the two prose tales, Chaucer's Tale of Meliobius and the Parson's Sermon or Treatise on Penitence, so as to save about 30 pages for the introduction of Chaucer's minor pieces. At the same time, by giving prose outlines of those omitted parts, it has been sought to guard the reader against the fear that he was losing anything essential or even valuable. It is almost needless to describe the plot, or point out the literary place of the Canterbury Tales, Perhaps in the entire range of ancient and modern literature there is no work that so clearly and freshly paints for future times the picture of the past. Certainly no Englishman has ever approached Chaucer in the power of fixing for ever the fleeting traits of his own time. The plan of the poem had been adopted before Chaucer chose it, notably in the Decameron of Boccaccio, although there the circumstances under which the tales were told, with the terror of the plague hanging over the merry company, lent a grim grotesqueness to the narrative, unless we can look at it abstracted from its setting. Chaucer, on the other hand, strikes a perpetual keynote of gaiety whenever he mentions the word pilgrimage, and at every stage of the connecting story we bless the happy thought which gives us the incessant incident, movement, variety, and unclouded but never monotonous joyousness. The poet, the evening before he starts on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury, lies at the Tabard Inn in Southwark, curious to know in what companionship he is destined to fare forward on the morrow. Chance sends him 29 in a company, representing all orders of English society, lay and clerical, from the knight and the abbot down to the ploughman and the sompnour. The jolly host of the Tabard, after supper, when tongues are loosed and hearts are opened, declares that not this year he has seen with such company at once under its roof-tree, and proposes that, when they set out the next morning, he should ride with them and make them sport. All agree, and Harry Bailey unfolds his scheme. Each pilgrim, according to the poet, shall tell 2 tales on the road to Canterbury, and 2 on the way back to London, and he whom the general voice pronounces to have told the best tale shall be treated to supper at the common cost, and of course to mine host's profit, when the cavalcade returns from the saint's shrine to the Southwark hostelry. All joyously assent, and early on the morrow, in the gay spring sunshine, they ride forth, listening to the heroic tale of the brave and gentle knight who has been gracefully chosen by the host to lead the spirited competition of the story-telling. To describe thus the nature of the plan, and to say that when Chaucer conceived, or at least began to execute it, he was between 60 and 70 years of age, is to proclaim that the Canterbury Tales could never be more than a fragment. 30 pilgrims, each telling 2 tales on the way out and 2 more on the way back, that makes 120 tales, to say nothing of the prologue, the description of the journey, the occurrences at Canterbury, and all the remnant of their pilgrimage, which Chaucer also undertook. No more than 23 of the 120 stories are told in the work as it comes down to us. That is, only 23 of the 30 pilgrims tell the first of the 2 stories on the road to Canterbury, while of the stories on the return journey we have not one, and nothing is said about the doings of the pilgrims at Canterbury, which would, if treated like the scene at the Tabard, have given us a still livelier picture of the period. But the plan was too large, and although the poet had some reserves in stories which he had already composed in an independent form, death cut short his labour ere he could even complete the arrangement and connection of more than a very few of the tales. Incomplete as it is, however, the magnum opus of Chaucer was in its own time received with immense favour. Manuscript copies are numerous, even now, no slight proof of its popularity, and when the invention of printing was introduced into England by William Caxton, the Canterbury Tales issued from his press in the year after the first English printed book, The Game of Cheese, had been struck off. Innumerable editions have since been published, and it may fairly be affirmed that few books have been so much in favour with the reading public of every generation as this book, which the lapse of every generation has been rendering more unreadable. Apart from the Romaunt of the Rose, no really important poetical work of Chaucer's is omitted from or unrepresented in the present edition. Of the legend of good women, the prologue only is given, but it is the most genuinely Chaucerian part of the poem. Of the court of love, 3/4 are here presented. Of the assembly of fowls, the cuckoo and the nightingale, the flower and the leaf, all of Chaucer's dream, 1/4 of the house of fame, 2/3, and of the minor poems such a selection as may give an idea of Chaucer's power in the occasional department of verse. Necessarily, no space whatever could be given to Chaucer's prose works. His translation of Boethius's treatise on the consolation of philosophy, his treatise on the astrolabe, written for the use of his son Lewis, and his testament of love, composed in his later years, and reflecting the troubles that then beset the poet. If, after studying in a simplified form the salient works of England's first great bard, the reader is tempted to regret that he was not introduced to a wider acquaintance with the author, the purpose of the editor will have been more than attained. The plan of the volume does not demand an elaborate examination into the state of our language when Chaucer wrote, or the nice questions of grammatical and metrical structure which conspire with the obsolete orthography to make his poems a sealed book for the masses. The most important element in the proper reading of Chaucer's verses, whether written in the decasyllabic or heroic metre, which he introduced to our literature, or in the octosyllabic measure used with such animated effect in The House of Fame, Chaucer's Dream, etc., is the sounding of the terminal e, where it is now silent. The letter is still valid in French poetry, and Chaucer's lines can be scanned only by reading them as we would read Racine's or Molière's. The terminal e played an important part in grammar. In many cases it was a sign of the infinitive, the n being dropped from the end. At other times it pointed the distinction between singular and plural, between adjective and adverb. The pages that follow, however, being prepared from the modern English point of view, necessarily no account is taken of these distinctions, and the now silent e has been retained in the text of Chaucer only when required by the modern spelling or the exigencies of metre. Before a word beginning with a vowel, or with the letter h, the final e was almost without exception mute, and in such cases, in the plural forms and infinitives of verbs, the terminal n was generally retained for the sake of euphony. No reader who is acquainted with the French language will find it hard to fall into Chaucer's accentuation, while, for such as are not, a simple perusal of the text according to the rules of modern verse should remove every difficulty. So ends The Life of Geoffrey Chaucer, from the Canterbury Tales and Other Poems of Geoffrey Chaucer, edited by D. Lang Purvis.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Hoover. The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Edited by D. Lang Purvis. This recording is based on the book The Canterbury Tales and Other Poems. The original text contains poems by Chaucer and a lot of notes and explanations by the editor. To view these, please click on the Gutenberg eText link on the LibriVox catalog page of the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales, the Prologue. When that Aprilis with his showers swoot, the drought of March hath pierced to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower, when Zephyrus eke with his swoot breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender crops and the youngest sun hath in the ram his half coursey run, and small fowls make melody, that sleepen all the night with open eye, so pricketh them nature in their courages. Then longe folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seek strange strands, to fern hollows couth in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that them hath holpen when that they were sick. Befell that in that season on a day in Southwark at the Tabard as I lay, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with devout courage, at night was come into that hostelry well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by adventure y fall in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury would ride. The chamber and the stables were wide, and well we were in eased at the best. And shortly, when the sun was to rest, so had I spoken with them every one, that I was of their fellowship anon, and made forward early for to rise, to take our way there as I you devised. But natheless, while I have time and space, ere that I farther in this tale pace, methinketh it accordant to reason to tell you all of the condition of each of them, so as it seemed to me, and which they weren, and of what degree, and eke in what array that they were in. And at a knight then will I first begin. A knight there was, and that a worthy man, that from the time that he first began to ridden out, he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. Full worthy was he in his lord's war, and thereto had he ridden, no man far as well in Christendom as in heathenness, and ever honoured for his worthiness at Alisander he was, when it was won. Full oftentime he had the board begun above all nations in Prussa. In Letoa had he raised, and in Russa no Christian man so oft of his degree. In Grenade at the siege eke had he be of Algesir, and ridden in Belle Marie. At Lays was he, and at Sadely when they were won. And in the great sea at many a noble army had he be. At mortal battles had he been 15, and foughten for our faith at Tramacene. In lists thrice, and I slain his foe. This ilke worthy knight had been also some time with the Lord of Palatine, against another heathen in Turkey, and evermore he had a sovereign price. And though he was worthy, he was wise, and of his port as meek as is a maid. He never yet no villainy ne said in all his life, unto no man or wight. He was a very perfect gentle knight. But for to tell you of his array, his horse was good, but yet he was not gay. Of fustian he weared a jippon, all besmottered with his habergeon, for he was late y come from his voyage, and wente for to do his pilgrimage. With him there was his son, a young squire, a lover and a lusty bachelor, with locks curl as they were laid in press. Of 20 years of age he was, I guess. Of his stature he was of even length, and wonderly deliver, and great of strength. And he had been some time in Chevachy, in Flanders, in Artois, and Picardy, and borne him well, as of so little space, and hoped to standen in his lady's grace. Embroidered was he, as it were made all full of freshe flowers, white and red. Singing he was, or fluting all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, with sleeves long and wide. Well could he sit on horse, and fair a ride. He coulde songs make, and well indite, joust, and eke dance, as well portray and write. So hot he loved, that by night or tale he slept no more than doth the nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved before his father at the table. A yeoman had he, and servants no mo at that time, for him list ride so, and he was clad in coat and hood of green. A sheaf of peacock arrows bright and keen under his belt he bare full thriftily. Well could he dress his tackle yeomanly. His arrows drooped not with feathers low, and in his hands he bare a mighty bow. A nuthead had he, with a brown visage. Of woodcraft could he well all the usage. Upon his arms he bare a gay bracer, and by his side a sword and a buckler. And on that other's side a gay dagger, harnessed well, and sharp as point of spear. Christopher on his breast of silver sheen, and horn he bare, the baldric was of green. A forester was he, soothly, as I guess. There was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Loy, and she was cleped Madame Eglantine. Full well she sang the service divine, and tuned in her nose full seemly. In French she spake full fair and fetisly after the school of Stratford at Abo, for French of Paris was to her unknow. At Meta was she well y taught withal. She let no morsel from her lippes fall, nor wet her fingers in her sauce deep. Well could she carry a morsel, and well keep that no droppe ne fell upon her breast. In courtesy was set full much her lest. Her overlippe wiped she so clean, that in her cup there was no farthing seen of grease, when she drunken had her draught. Full seemly after her meat she wrought, and sickerly she was of great disport, and full pleasant and amiable of port, and pained her to counterfeit a cheer of court, and be a stately of mannere, and to behold in digny of reverence. But for to speaken of her conscience, she was so charitable and so piteous, she woulde weep if that she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled. Of smalle hounds had she, that she fed with roasted flesh and milk and wastel bread. But sore she wept if one of them were dead, or if men smote it with a yarde smart. And all was conscience and tender heart. Full seemly her wimple pinched was, her nose tretis, her eyen grey as glass, her mouth full small, and thereto soft and red. But sickerly she had a fair forehead. It was almost a spanne brow, I trow, for hardily she was not undergrow. Full fettis was her cloak, as I was ware. Of small coral about her arm she bare a pair of beads, gauded all with green, and thereon hung a brooch of gold full sheen, on which first written and crowned and after, Amor vincit omnia. Another nun also with her had she, that was her chapelaine, and priestess 3. A monk there was, a fair for the mastery, an outrider that loved venery, a manly man, to be an abbot able. Full many a dainty horse had he in stable, and when he rode, men might his bridle hear jingling in a whistling wind as clear and eke as loud as doth the chapel bell, there as his lord was keeper of the cell. The rule of Saint Mare and of Saint Benet, because that was old and some deal straight, this ilke monk let olde things pace, and held after the newe world the trace. He was not of the text a pulled hen that saith that hunters be not holy men. Nay, that a monk, when he is cloisterless, is like to a fish that is waterless. This is to say, a monk out of his cloister, this ilke text held he not worth an oyster. And I say his opinion was good. Why should he study and make himself wood upon a book, and cloister always poor? Or swinken with his hands, and labour as Austin bid? How shall the world be served? Let Austin have his swink to him reserved. Therefore he was a prickosore right. Greyhounds he had as swift as fowl of flight. Of pricking and of hunting for the hare was all his lust, for no cost would he spare. I saw his sleeves are filled at the hand with gris, and that the finest of the land. And for to fasten his hood under his chin, he had of goldywrought a curious pin, a love knot in the greater end there was. His head was bald, and shone as any glass, and eke his face, as it had been anoint. He was a lord full fat and in good point, his eyen steep and rolling in his head, that steamed as a furnace of a lead. His boots supple, his horse in great estate. Now certainly he was a fair prelate. He was not pale as a four-pined ghost, a fat swan loved he best of any roast. His palfrey was as brown as is a berry. A friar there was, a wanton and a merry, a limitour, a full solemn man. In all the orders four is none that can so much of dalliance and fair language. He had y made full many a marriage of younge women at his owen cost. Unto his order he was a noble post. Full well beloved, and familiar was he with franklins over all in his country, and eke with worthy women of the town. For he had power of confession, as said himself more than a curate, for of his order he was licentiate. Full sweetly heard he confession, and pleasant was his absolution. He was an easy man to give penance, there as he wist to have a good pittance. For unto a poor order for to give is sign that a man is well yshrive. For if he gave, he durst make avaunt, he wist that the man was repentant. For many a man so hard is of his heart, he may not weep although him sore smart. Therefore instead of weeping and prayeres, men must give silver to the poor freres. His tippet was aye farced full of knives and pins for to give to fair wives, and certainly he had a merry note. Well could he sing and playen on a rote. Of yettings he bare utterly the prize. His neck was white as is the fleur de lis, Thereto he strong was as a champion. He knew well the taverns in every town, and every hostler and gay tapster better than a lazer or a beggara. For unto such a worthy man as he accordeth not, as by his faculty, to have with such lazers acquaintance. It is not honest, it may not advance, as for to deal with no such poor ale, but all with rich and sellers of vitail. And over all there his profit should arise. Courteous he was, and lowly of service, and as no man nowhere so virtuous. He was the best beggar in all his house, and gave a certain frame for the grant. None of his brethren came into his haunt. For though a widow had but one shoe, so pleasant was his in principio, yet he would have a farthing ere he went. His purchase was well better than his rent. And rage he could and play as any whelp in love days. There could he muchel help. For there was he not like a cloisterer, with threadbare scope, as is a poor scholar, but he was like a master or a pope. Of double worsted was his semicope, that rounded him as a bell out of press. Somewhat he lisped for his wantonness, to make his English sweet upon his tongue, and in his harping, when that he had sung, his eyen twinkled in his head aright, as do the stars in a frosty night. This worthy limitour was called Huberd. A merchant was there with a forked beard, and motley, and high on his horse he sat. Upon his head a Flandrish beaver hat. His boots clasped fair and fetisly. His reasons aye spake he full solemnly, sounding alway the increase of his winning. He would the sea were kept for anything betwixt a Middleburg and Orwell. Well could he in exchange shields sell, this worthy man full well his wit beset. There wiste no wight that he was in debt, so stately was he of governance with his bargains and with his chevasance. Forsooth he was a worthy man withal, but sooth to say I not how men him call. A clerk there was of Oxenford also, that unto logic had a long ago. As lean was his horse as is a rake, and he was not right fat, I undertake, but looked hollow, and thereto soberly. Full threadbare was his over's courtpie, for he had not gotten him yet no benefice, nay was not worldly, to have an office. For him was lever have at his bed's head 20 books, clothed in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than robes rich, or fiddle, or psaltery. But all be that he was a philosopher, yet hadde he but little gold in coffer. But all that he might of his friends hent, on books and on learning, he it spent, and busily gan for the souls pray of them that gave him wherewith to schole. Of study took he most care and heed. Not one word spake he more than was need, and that was said in form and reverence, and short and quick, and full of high sentence. Sounding in moral virtue was his speech, and gladly would he learn, and gladly teach. A sergeant of the law, wary and wise, that often had he been at the parvis, there was also full rich of excellence. Discreet he was, and of great reverence. He seemed such, his words were so wise, justice he was full often in assize, by patent and by plain commission. For his science and for his high renown, of fees and robes had he many won. So great a purchaser was nowhere none. All was fee simple to him. In effect his purchasing might not be in suspect. Nowhere so busy a man as he there was, and yet he seemed busier than he was. In terms had he case and doom as all that from the time of King Will were fall. Thereto he could indite, and make a thing there coulde no wight pinch at his writing. In every statute could he plain by rote. He rode but homely, in a medley coat, girt with a scent of silk, with barras small. Of his array tell I no longer tale. A francolin was in this company. White was his beard as is the daisy. Of his complexion he was sanguine. Well loved he in the morn a sop and wine. To liven in delight was ever his one, for he was Epicurus Owen's son. That held opinion in plain delight was verily felicity per fight. An householder, and that a great was he. Saint Julian, he was in his country. His bread, his ale, was always after one. A better envined man was nowhere none. Without bake meat never was his house. Of fish and flesh, and that so plenteous. It snowed in his house of meat and drink, of alle dainties that men coulde think. After the sundry seasons of the year, so changed he his meat and his souper. Many full fat partridge had he in mew, and many a bream, and many a lucerne stew. Woe was his cook but if his sauce were poignant and sharp, and ready all his gear. His table dormant in his hall always stood ready covered all the longe day. At sessions there was he lord and sire. Full oftentime he was knight of the shire. An anlace and a gipsere, all of silk, hung at his girdle, white as morning milk. A sheriff had he been, and a contour was nowhere such a worthy vavasor. An haberdasher and a carpenter, a webbe, a dyer, and a tapisser were with us eke, clothed in one livery, of a solemn and great fraternity. Full fresh and new their gear y picked was. Their knives were y chipped not with brass, but all with silver wrought full clean and well. Their girdles and their pouches every deal. Well seemed each of them a fair burgess, to sitten in a guild hall on the dais. Evereach for the wisdom that he can was shapely for to be an alderman. For chattels hadde they enough and rent, and eke their wives would it well assent, and elles certain they had been to blame. It is full fair to be a clept madam, and for to go to vigils all before, and have a mantle royally bore. A cook they hadde with them for the nones, to boil the chickens and the marrow bones, and powder merchant tart and gallingal. Well could he know a draught of London ale. He could roast and stew and broil and fry, make mortrews, and well bake a pie. But great harm was it, as it thought to me, that on his shin a mormel hadde he. For blanc manger, that made he with the best. A shipman was there, one far by west, for aught I wot be was of Dartmouth. He rode upon a rounsey as he couth, all in a gown of falding to the knee. A dagger hanging by a lace had he about his neck under his arm adown. The hot summer had made his hue all brown. And certainly he was a good fellow. Full many a draught of wine had he y draw. From Bordeaux ward, while the chapmen sleep, of nice conscience took he no keep. If that he fought, and had the higher hand, by water he sent them home to every land. But of his craft to reckon well his tides, his steames and his strandes him besides, his Herbero, his moon, and laud manage, there was none such from Hull unto Carthage. Hardly he was, and wise, I undertake, with many a tempest had his beard been shake. He knew well all the havens as they were, from Scotland to the Cape of Finisterre. In every creek in Bretagne and in Spain, his barge yclept was the Magdalene. With us there was a doctor of physic, and all this world was there none him like, to speak of physic and of surgery, for he was grounded in astronomy. He kept his patient a full great deal in hours by his magic natural. Well could he fortune the ascendant of his images for his patient. He knew the cause of every malady, were it of cold or hot or moist or dry, and where engendered, and of what humour. He was a very perfect practisour, the cause you know, and of his harm the root. Anon he gave the sick man his boot. Full ready had he his apothecaries, to send his drugs and his lecturies. For each of them made other for to win their friendship was not new to begin. Well knew he the old Escalipus, and Dioscorides, and eke Rufus, old Hippocras, Hali, and Gallian, Serapion, Rhasis, and Avicen, Averroes, Damascene, and Constantine, Bernard, and Gattiston, and Gilbertin. Of his diet measurable was he, for it was of no superfluity, but of great nourishing and digestible. His study was but little on the Bible. In sanguine and in purse he glad was all, lined with taffeta and with sendal. And yet he was but easy of dispense, he kept that he won in the pestilence. For gold in physic is a cordial, therefore he loved gold in special. A good wife was there of beside Bath, but she was some deal deaf, and that was scath. Of cloth making she had in such an haunt, she passed them of Ypres and of Gaunt. In all the parish wife was there none that to the offering before her should gon, and if there did, certain so wroth was she that she was out of all a charity. Her coverchiefs were full fine of ground. I durste swear they weighed 10 pound, that on Sunday were upon her head. Her hosen were of fine scarlet red, full straight y tied, and shoes full moist and new. Bold was her face, and fair and red of hue. She was a worthy woman all her life. Husbands at the church door had she had 5, withouten other company in youth. But thereof needeth not to speak as newth. And thrice had she been at Jerusalem. She had passed many a strange stream. At Rome she had been, and at Boulogne, in Gallus and St. James, and at Cologne. She coulde much of wandering by the way. Gat-toothed was she, soothly for to say. Upon an ambler easily she sat, y wimpled well, and on her head an hat as broad as is a buckler or a targe, a footmantle about her hips large, and on her feet a pair of spurs sharp. In fellowship well could she laugh and carp. Of remedies of love she knew perchance, for of that art she could the olde dance. A good man there was of religion, that was a poor parson of a town, but rich he was of holy thought and work. And he was also a learned man, a clerk, that Christ's gospel truly would he preach. His parishioners devoutly would he teach. Benign he was, and wonder diligent, and in adversity full patient. And such he was he proved often sithes. Full loth were him to curse for his tithes, but rather would he given out of doubt unto his poor parishioners about, of his offering and eke of his substance. He would in little thing have sufficence. Wide was his parish, and houses far asunder, but he ne left naught, for no rain nor thunder, in sickness and in mischief, to visit the farthest in his parish, much and lit, upon his feet and in his hands a staff. This noble example to his sheep he gaf, that first he wrought, and afterward he taught. Out of the gospel he the word is caught. In this figure he added yet thereto, that if gold rust, what should iron do? For if a priest be foul, on whom we trust, no wonder is a lewed man to rust. And shame it is, if that a priest take keep, to see a shitten shepherd and clean sheep. Well ought a priest an sample for to give, by his own cleanness, how his sheep should live. He sette not his benefice to hire, and left his sheep encumbered in the mire, and ran unto London, unto St. Paul's, to seek him a shantery for souls, or with a brotherhood to be withhold. But dwelled at home, and kept well his fold, so that the wolf ne made it not miscarry. He was a shepherd, and no mercenary. And though he holy were and virtuous, he was to sinful men not dispiteous, nor of his speech a dangerous nor dine, but in his teaching discreet and benign. To drawen folk to heaven with fairness, by good ensample was his business. But it were any person obstinate, whatso he were of high or low estate, him would he snibbe sharply for the nose. A better priest I trow that nowhere none is. He waited after no pomp nor reverence, nor maked him a spiced conscience. But Christ as Lord, and his apostles 12 he taught, and first he followed it himself. With him there was a ploughman, was his brother, that had he laid of dung full many a father. A true swinker and a good was he, living in peace and perfect charity. God loved he best with all his heart at alle times, were it gain or smart, and then his neighbour right as himself. He would thresh, and thereto dike and delve, for Christ's sake, for every poor wight, withouten hire, if it lay in his might. His tithes paid he full fair and well, both of his proper swink and his chattel, and at tabard he rode upon a mare. There was also a reeve, and a millera, a sompner, and a pardoner also, a mancipule, and myself. There were no mo'. The miller was a stout carle for the nones. Full big he was of brawn, and eke of bones. That proved well, for over all where he came, at wrestling he would bear away the rame. He was short-shouldered, broad, a thick gar. There was no door that he hold heave off bar, or break it at a running with his head. His beard as any sow or fox was red, and thereto broad, as though it were a spade. Upon the cop right of his nose he had a wart, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs red as the bristles of a sow's ear. His nose thurles black were and wide. A sword and buckler bare he by his side. His mouth as wide as was a furnace. He was a jangler and a golardice, and that was most sin and harlotries. Well could he steal a corn, and toll thrice, and yet he had a thumb of gold, pardie. A white coat and a blue hood weared he. A bagpipe well could he blow and sound, and therewithal he brought us out of town. A gentle manciple was there of a temple, of which acateurs mighte taken sample, for to be wise in buying of vitail. For whether that he paid, or took by tale, algate he waited so in his acate, that he was aye before in good estate. Now is not that of God a full fair grace, that such a lewd man as which shall pace the wisdom of an heap of learned men. Of masters had he more than thrice 10, that were of law expert and curious, of which there was a dozen in that house, worthy to be stewards of rent and land of any lord that is in England, to make him live by his proper good, in honour debtless, but if he would, or live as scarcely as him list desire, and able for to help in all a shire. In any case, that might a fall or hap, and yet this manciple set their aller cap. The reeve was a slender choleric man. His beard was shaved as high as ever he can. His hair was by his ears round y shorn. His top was docked like a priest beforn. Full longe were his legs, and full lean, like a staff. There was no calf y seen. Well could he keep a garner and a bin. There was no auditor could on him win. Well wist he by the drought, and by the rain, the yielding of his seed and of his grain. His lord's sheep, his neat, and his dairy, his swine, his horse, his store, and his poultry were wholly in this reeve's governing, and by his covenant gave he reckoning. Since that his lord was 20 year of age, there could no man bring him in arrearage. There was no bailiff, herd, nor other hine, that he ne knew his sleight and his covine. They were adrad of him, as of the death. His wonning was full fair. Upon an heath with green trees ashadowed was his place. He could a better than his lord purchase. Full rich he was y stored privily. His lord well could he please subtilly to give and lend him of his own good, and have a thank, and yet a coat and hood. In youth he learned, had a good mister, he was well good right, a carpenter. This reeve sat upon a right good stot, that was all palmly grey, and hight a Scot. A long surcoat of purse upon he had, and by his side he bare a rusty blade. Of Norfolk was this reeve, of which I tell, beside a town man clepen Baldeswell. Tucked he was, as is a friar about, and never rode the hinderest of the rout. A Sompnour was there with us in that place, that had a fire-red cherubin's face, for sus flame he was, with eye narrow. As hot he was, and lecherous as a sparrow, with scalled brows black, and pilled beard. Of his visage children were sore afeard. And as quicksilver, lithards, nor brimstone, borus, cerus, nor oil of tartar none, nor ointment that would cleanse or bite, that him might helpen of his welcus white, nor of the knobs sitting on his cheeks. Well loved he garlic, onions, and leeks, and for to drink strong wine as red as blood. Then would he speak, and cry as he were wood, and when he well drunken had the wine, then would he speak no word but Latin. A few terms knew he, 2 or 3, that he had learned out of some decree. No wonder is, he heard it all the day. And eke he knowen well how that a jay can clappen wat as well as can the Pope. But whoso would another thing him grope, that he had spent all his philosophy, aye quistio quid juris, would he cry. He was a gentle harlot, and a kind. A better fellow should a man not find. He would suffer for a quart of wine. A good fellow to have his concubine a 12-month, and excuse him at the full. Full privily a finch eke could he pull. And if he found where a good fellow, he would teach him to have none awe. In such a case as the archdeacon's curse. But if a man's soul were in his purse, for in his purse he should ye punished be. Purse is the archdeacon's hell, said he. But well I wot he lied right indeed. Of cursing ought each guilty man to dread, for curse will slay right as a sailing Sabbath, and also wear him of significat. In danger had he at his own guise the younge girls of the diocese, and knew their counsel, and was of their rede. A garland had he set upon his head, as great as if it were for an ale stake. A buckler had he made him of a cake. With him there rode a gentle pardoner of Ronceville, his friend and his compere, that straight was comen from the court of Rome. Full loud he sang, "Come hither, love, to me." This Sompnour bare to him a stiff burden, was never trump of half so great a sound. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, but smooth it hung, as doth a strike of flax. By ounces hung his locks that he had, and therewith he his shoulders overspread. Full thin it lay by culpins one and one, but hood for jollity he weared none, for it was trussed up in his wallet. Him thought he rode all of the newagate, dishevel, save his cap, he rode all bare. Such glaring eyen had he as in hair. A vernicle had he sewed upon his cap. His wallet lay before him in his lap. Breadful of pardon, come from Rome all hot. A voice he had as small as hath a goat. No beard had he, nor ever one should have. As smooth it was as it were new y shave. I trow he were a gelding or a mare. But of his craft from Berwick unto Ware, ne was there such another pardoner. For in his mail he had a pillow bare, which, as he said, was Our Lady's veil. He said he had a gobbet of the sail that Saint Peter had, when that he went upon the sea, till Jesus Christ him hent. He had a cross of Latin foul of stones, and in a glass he had pig's bones. But with these relics, when that he fond, a poor parson dwelling upon lond, upon a day he got him more money than the parson got in moneths tway. And thus with feigned flatterings and japes he made the parson and the people his apes. But truly to tellen at the last, he was in church a noble ecclesiast. Well could he read a lesson or a story, but alderbast he sang an offertory. For well he wiste, when that song was sung, he muste preach and well affile his tongue, to win silver as he right well could. Therefore he sang full merrily and loud. Now have I told you shortly in a clause the estate, the array, the number, and eke the cause why that assembled was this company in Southwark at this gentle hostelry, that highte the tabard fast by the bell. But now is time for you to tell how that we bare in us that ilke night, when we were in that hostelry aright, and after will I tell of our voyage, and all the remnant of our pilgrimage. But first I pray you of your courtesy, that ye arret it not my villainy, though that I plainly speak in this matter, to tellen you their words and their cheer. Not though I speak their words properly, for this ye know and also well as I, whoso shall tell a tale after a man, he must rehearse as nigh as ever he can, every word if it be in his charge. I'll speak he ne'er so rudely and so large. Or elles he must tell his tale untrue, or feign things, or find words new. He may not spare although he were his brother, he must as well say one word as another. Christ spake himself full broad in holy writ, and well ye wot no villainy is it. Eke Plato saith, whoso that can him read, the words must be cousin to the deed. Also I pray you to forgive it me, as have I not set folk in their degree. Here in this tale, as that they shoulden stand, my wit is short, ye may well understand. Great cheer made our host us every one, and to the supper set he us anon, and served us with victual of the best. Strong was the wine, and well to drink us lest. A seemly man our host was withal, for to have been a marshal in an hall. A large man he was with eye and steep, a fairer burgess is there none and cheap. Bold of his speech and wise and well y taught, and of manhood lacked him right naught. Eke thereto he was right a merry man, and after supper playen he began, and spake of mirth amongs other things. When that we had made our reckonings, and said thus, now, lordings, truly ye be to me welcome right heartily, for by my troth, if that I shall not lie, I saw not this year such a company at once in this herborough, Misenal. Fain would I do you mirth, and I wist how. And of a mirth I am right now bethought, to do you ease, and it shall cost naught. Ye go to Canterbury, God you speed, the blissful martyr quite you your meed. And well I wot, as ye go by the way, ye shapen you to talken and to play, for truly comfort nor mirth is none, to ride by the way as dumb as stone. And therefore would I make you disport, as I said erst, and do you some comfort. And if you liketh, all by one assent, now for to stand in at my judgment, and for to worken as I shall you say tomorrow, when ye riden on the way, now by my father's soul that is dead, but ye be merry, smiteth off mine head. Hold up your hands without more speech. Our counsel was not long afore to seach. Us thought it was not worth to make it wise, and granted him without more avise, and bade him say his verdict as him lest. Lordings, quoth he, now hearken for the best, but take it not, I pray you, in disdain. This is the point, to speak it platt and plain, that each of you, to shorten with your way in this voyage, shall tell in tales tway, to Canterbury ward, I mean it so, and homeward he shall tell in other two. of adventures that whilom have befall, and which you that beareth him best of all, that is to say, that telleth in this case tales of best sentence and most solace, shall have a supper at your aller cost, here in this place, sitting by this post, when that ye come again from Canterbury. And for to make you the more merry, I will myself gladly with you ride, right at mine own cost, and be your guide. And whoso will my judgment with say, shall pay for all we spenden by the way. And if ye vouchsafe that it be so, tell me anon without words mo, and I will early shape me therefore. This thing was granted, and our oath we swore with full glad heart, and prayed him also that he would vouchsafe for to do so, and that he would be our governor, and of our tales judge and repertoire, and set a supper at a certain price, and we will ruled be at his device, in high and low, and thus by one assent we be accorded to his judgment. And thereupon the wine was fetten on, we drunken, and to rest went each one, without any longer tarrying. Amorrow, when the day began to spring, uprose our host, and was our allercock, and gathered us together in a flock, and forth we rid in all a little space unto the watering of St. Thomas. And there our host began his horse arrest, and said, Lords, hearken if you lest, to weet your forward, and I it record, if evensong and morning song accord. Let's see now who shall telle the first tale. As ever may I drink a wine or ale, whoso is rebel to my judgment shall pay for all that by the way is spent. Now draw ye cuts, ere that ye farther twin, he which that hath the shortest shall begin. Sir Knight, quoth he, my master and my lord, now draw the cut, for that is mine accord. Come near, quoth he, my lady prioress, and ye, sir clerk, let be your shamefastness, nor study naught, lay hand to every man. Anon to draw, and every wight began. And shortly for to tellen as it was, were it by aventure, or sort, or cost, the sooth is this: the cut fell to the knight, of which full blithe and glad was every wight. And tell he must his tale as was reason, by foreword and by composition, as ye have heard. What needeth words mo? And when this good man saw that it was so, as he that wise was and obedient to keep his foreword by his free assent, he said, Sithen, I shall begin this game. Why, welcome be the cut in Godde's name. Now let us ride, and hearken what I say. And with that word we ridden forth our way, and he began with right merry cheer his tale anon, and said, as you shall hear. End of the general prologue.
Hello. So, there we go. We didn't even get into the books yet. Almost is 2 hours. 2 hours of just the prologue. Apparently. 1 hour and 47 minutes. That's awesome. I'm glad you loved it. It's all good. All the stories are almost all of them are an hour plus. There's a few that aren't, but most of them are. That's okay, we'll plug along at them. And Faye, just so you know, if by the time we get to Halloween, the day, whichever day is closest to Halloween, I'm probably going to put on some H.P. Lovecraft, so we might take a break just for the night. First was a bit of a biography. Awesome. And you've got another book after this, so but it's awesome. I like it. It's something to listen to while I do stuff and spend time with friends. So and apparently I have another this much to go. Maybe about this much more. And this is going to be a table runner for my end table. Biography followed by the prologue. Yeah, it's I didn't mind it. It's interesting because if you don't know the history at all, you learn a little bit. So anyway, I've got the yawns and my head is killing me. The weather turned. I think the wind switched direction because I get a pain in my eye whenever it does that. So I think the barometric pressure changes or something. I get a really bad pain in my eye. So I think that's going on. Christopher Marlowe's Faust. What's that? Is that the next book? Current book. Oh, no, that's not the next book. The next book is The Path of Atheism by Anne Besant. But if you want me to put Christopher Marlowe's Faust on there, I can certainly do that too. I will look that up right now. Yeah, you hadn't asked for the Christopher Marlowe's Faust yet, so I will put that on there we'll put it in the list. But like I said, once we get up to around Halloween, I want to listen to a bit of H.P. Lovecraft. He has some awesome things too. I love the writer. He's a horrible person, but but love the writer. So love you guys. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful night, and we'll talk to you later. Okay? Yay! Bye. Oh, and Beowulf. Okay, we can add Beowulf to the list too. Absolutely. Okay, we'll talk to you later, ladies and gents. I think there's only one or two. Love you guys. Bye.